أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ظاهريا تهيمن الحروب الثقافية، السياسة الأميركية، الإجهاض وحقوق المثليين، وحظر الكتب، وحياة السود مهمة، والقائمة تطول. هذه هي المواضيع التي تناشط أو تثير حفيظة الملايين من الناخبين، وتضخ مئات الملايين من الدولارات من المساهمات في الحملات الانتخابية، وما لا يكون أهمية عنها، والذي غالبا ما يكون مخفيا عن الأنظار، هي النقاشات الوطنية العميقة حول الاقتصاد. في بعض الأحيان تدور هذه النقاشات حول السياسة الضريبية، وفي أحيان أخرى حول السياسة الصناعية، وأحيانا كذلك تتعلق بمسألة العدالة، وأحيانا أخرى تكون المسألة حول ما يجدر بالحكومة فعله لمكافحة التغير المناخي، ثم تكون أحيانا حول دور البنك الاحتياطي الفيدرالي في تحديد أسعار الفائدة. لكن الأمر كله يتعلق بالاقتصاد، وهو ما يؤثر على كل فرد أمريكي. لمناقشة القضايا الاقتصادية التي تشكل جوهر النقاشات السياسية بين حزبين وداخل كل حزب منهما، يسعدني أن أرحب بضيوفنا من الخبراء البارزين بيتر موريسي وباولو فان شراك ونيومي ليم. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Cultural issues get a lot of attention, from abortion to gun rights to whether there should be books banned in our nation's libraries. But economic issues are what motivates most voters, and they're the hot political topics. This week, with Naomi Lim and Peter Morisi, we're going to look at the intersection of politics and economics. Thank you so much for joining us today. Naomi, let's begin with Bidenomics. This is a term the White House has coined. I don't remember this from undergraduate economics class, but I assume it has a meaning. What does it mean, and what does it have any real relevance for the American economy today?
Well, what's really interesting about the term Bidenomics is it actually was started by a Wall Street Journal opinion piece where they kind of use it as criticism, basically sort of saying that Biden's, touting how he's helping the middle class through tax cuts and things like that may not be, promoting economic growth, and particularly isn't helping cut out inflation. But then what they've done, because they realize that the election will be framed by this issue, they're trying to own it. And I think what we're seeing is this real pushing of things that they've done to help, as I said, the middle class. It's a voting constituent that the Democrats have struggled with in recent times. And basically what they're sort of pushing is how they're trying to fight inflation, because when you look at polling, inflation is sort of the top concern. Whether they're succeeding is another matter.
And Peter, what does the term mean anything to you?
Well, first of all, there's an historical parallel. Obamacare originally started out as a pejorative about President Obama's national health care insurance system that was created by the Affordable Care Act. And then he said, I saw him on TV say, no, I like the phrase. Let's go with that. He didn't put out a press release. He says, yeah, this is my baby. Then in the election that followed, it really hurt Hillary Clinton because the premiums jumped in October of the year she was elected and so forth, and it kind of backfired. But the term stuck, and over time, actually, people have embraced it. I can't say that people want to get rid of the system now. But to me, what it means is redirecting the U.S. economy so that there's a greater emphasis on manufacturing again, in particular, home shoring or things like semiconductor manufacturing, and getting the automobile industry caught up with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese have subsidized the heck out of the automobile industry, but to their credit, they have created a rather efficient automobile sector that can produce electric vehicles quite well. You know, Musk and the Chinese manufacturers are both in China, and the Chinese manufacturers are outdoing him. The second thing about it is in laying out all these benefits, providing all these opportunities, they want to bias it a bit in favor of minorities and women, owing to the notion they were underrepresented in the past. And that probably plays well with communities that would already vote for him anyway. So that he doesn't get he's not going to get a lot of political mileage out of this. The important thing is, though, is that a lot of this was paid for with deficit spending. And as a consequence, it's got fingerprints all over the inflation we're having. And if Americans don't understand, but perhaps believe anything, it's that deficits and inflation go hand in hand. And this big jump in the deficit we've had, and the fact that we've had inflation is making it very difficult it's kind of like a can tied to the Democrats' tail. It's the reason that although Trump, Lord knows, is damaged goods, he's polling even with the president right now in national general election polls.
All right, so you've just raised a whole bunch of different aspects of the overall topic of economics and politics. Naomi, how do you see the politics of this? Is there, for example, any constituency for old-fashioned free trade left in the American political system?
I mean, I think that's something that we'll see. I think it's sort of two buckets when it comes to this sort of manufactural industrial base. As you know, Peter mentioned, there's this national security component of it, particularly after the pandemic, and this sort of understanding of how overly reliant the global economy is on China, particularly at a moment when the Chinese economy is not particularly performing very well.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about some other hot button economic issues: the Federal Reserve, taxes, always a favorite, and of course, the potential implications of a government shutdown. We'll be back with Naomi and Peter in just a moment. Our guests again today include Naomi Lim. Naomi is the White House reporter at the Washington Examiner. She previously reported on crime and politics for News Corp in her native Australia. And is Peter Morisi. Peter is emeritus professor at the University of Maryland's Smith School of Business, a recognized expert on economic policy and international economics. He served in government as chief economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. All right, just one more. I hate to push this button, but free trade, are there any advocates left for good old-fashioned free trade in the American political system, Peter?
Well, I don't think you could find 7 people that are in favor of the World Trade Organization in America right now. But there are a lot of people, especially Bush Republicans, the old neocons, who are very much in favor of free trade agreements and are very disappointed this president, and in the economics profession, that this president is against all free trade agreements. Many of us think he should rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership and negotiate a deal with Britain. And he's gotten a lot of blowback about that. But frankly, right now, people aren't listening very much to economists. After all, look who's chairing the Federal Reserve, who's running the European Central Bank, and so forth. Economists are out of style this year.
All right. So speaking of the Federal Reserve, Naomi, we talked at the top of the show about inflation, which you cited as the chief concern of voters in many polls. Well, the Federal Reserve has a lot to do with fighting inflation. How do most voters think the Federal Reserve is doing in meeting that task?
I mean, I think that it's interesting covering the White House. They sort of say that they want to keep, it's an independent body. They try to sort of stay out of fiscal policy. I think that, voters, I think, don't understand everything about the way that this thing happens. All they know is that prices, while headline inflation has gone down from last summer, it is still affecting, their groceries. They're going to the gas pump and filling up their pumps, and it's more expensive than ever. So I think there's this dissatisfaction with the Federal Reserve, but it's indirect. I don't think that they blame the Federal Reserve for not being able to meet its 2% target. I think they're blaming things like Bidenomics, like the president. And so I think that that's something that's really difficult for the White House to contend with, because there isn't a lot that they can do. Republicans would obviously say they disagree. They see that, Biden contributed to inflation because he supported these massive spending packages. So I think that now that that's gone through, the White House is trying to figure out how to contend with this.
Actually, we're joined now by Paolo Van Schirach, who's with us on the show, just in time for a discussion about whether Americans should be blaming the Federal Reserve, or should they be applauding how the Federal Reserve has been handling inflation over the last couple of years. Paolo, do you have a view on this?
I do, actually. I think, unfortunately, the Federal Reserve is both, I guess, the arsonist and the fire brigade at the same time. Let me see if I can explain this. The problem is, unfortunately, beyond the Fed control. The Fed has engaged in the past 20 years in a policy of easing that seemed to be great because, low long-term interest rates. Is that wonderful? Mortgages at 3%. Everybody can borrow, money can do stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been gone, under Bernanke and then under Powell and Janet Yellen before him, like it's fine, no problem. Hey, no inflation. Here we've defied gravity. We can have low interest rates forever. Anybody can borrow cheaply forever, and there are no consequences. Well, the consequences are indeed in this bad policy, which, by the way, it took quite a while to the Fed to recognize that inflation was a real issue. We all remember when they said at the beginning, oh, nothing, this is just the impact of supply chain disruptions due to COVID. As soon as international commerce and supply chains go back to normal, hey, a little bit bout of inflation will go away, right? We remember that. But there's another problem here, which is really, really important, which is government spending. And the government spending has now become colossal to an extent that would give, remember David Stockman in the old days of Donald Reagan? And he said, oh my God, we're going to see $400 billion deficit as the eye can see. Now we're measuring the annual deficit in trillions of dollars, and nobody blinks. So does that have any impact on inflation? You bet it does. Large government spending is inflationary.
All right. So, Peter, why don't you come in on this? Federal Reserve, what responsibility are they playing? Do you see them as arsonist, firefighter, or bystander to the underlying problems of the American economy?
Mr. Powell is like a child playing with matches. He really doesn't come with an adequate background for this work. So as he was printing all that money, if the right people said to him that inflation was transitory, he would listen to them because he's fundamentally a political animal and he's a lawyer. And he behaved through the process as if he could convince markets it would go away, that would go away. Like if you can convince the jury the guy caught with a gun over a body is innocent, he becomes innocent. In reality, now they're trying to pull things back, but Biden has politicized the Fed somewhat. For example, Goolsbee, the Chicago Fed president that he put there, at every available turn, he's talking about patience and the prospects of a soft landing and so forth. If you go back and look at recessions, just before recessions, there's lots and lots of press sightings of soft landings, people predicting soft landings. My feeling is that he's like a little boy who doesn't want to take his medicine. We need to clamp down on the economy now, accept a recession, even if it's a tough one, get through it, get inflation down, or it's going to be with us a long time. That was the history of these things in the 70s. They'd clamp down for a bit, and then they'd ease back. So the inflation would go down, and then it would peak at a higher level, go down, and then peak at yet another higher level 4 times until they finally had to deal with it. I think that we're sort of going through that with him now. I don't think they're doing enough. I think they could do more. And I think that President Biden gives lip service to an independent Fed, but he has certainly appointed where he can people who would lean on Powell to be lenient rather than strict.
Well, Naomi, there's no president who wants to have a recession in an election year. So when we look out through to 2024, what do you see as the White House's approach to balancing sort of responsible government and re-election prospects for the president?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, Republicans like to remind reporters that technically there was sort of a soft recession last year because we had 2 quarters of a lack of growth. I think looking forward, I think the growth trajectory seemed to be a little bit stronger. So I think that the White House is confident that we can sort of land this soft landing. I think that they are sort of, it's like a wait and see kind of thing. They're trying to, I think, push this consumer confidence side of that in the hope that that will help, consumer spending continue and things like that. And so I think that they are quietly confident with lots of crossed fingers.
So, Paulo, between now and then, chances are not insignificant that we're going to have a government shutdown. And given the mess that we call politics on Capitol Hill, it might not be a very brief shutdown as well. How will all of that affect larger economic concerns in the United States?
Well, look, markets hate political uncertainty, right? We know that. That's kind of an old cliche. And there's no worse political uncertainty that nobody at the office in Washington. And certainly the bond markets are not going to take this gently to say, oh, no problem. We just wait and see what happens. I think this will have a pressure on higher bond yields. And clearly, we have no idea how this is going to pan out. Is there going to be a budget that will reflect the earlier deal that was cut between the White House, the Senate, and Speaker McCarthy a few months ago? Or is it going to be something else or nothing at all? We have really no idea. This is uncharted territory. I mean, we know that this is the very first time in US history that a speaker gets booted by a vote. That's never happened before. So it's not like we know how this is going to play out. And I don't think this is a good prospect for markets. But that being that as it may, the budget, even if it's approved along the guidelines that were agreed a while ago, it is an inflationary budget. We are spending like there is no tomorrow. And there is no conversation on the real drivers of spending, which are entitlement programs. And nobody wants to touch them. Even the diehard MAGA Republicans that accuse McCarthy of spending too much money, they were not serious about cuts. Nobody's serious about cuts at this time. And if that is not going to be addressed, we will continue to have deficits, huge deficits, even if you cut here, cut there a little bit, trim agriculture, trim, transportation, give a little bit less money to NASA. I don't know what you can do, but that's peanuts. That's not where the real money is in the federal government. So we are in an inflationary government mode, so to speak, because we're spending a lot of money that we don't have, which means more borrowing and means flooding the economy with cash. That means inflation continues. And of course, as you just said, going into an election year, which president wants to say, I think a recession is really good because long-term America gains, and please vote for me. Yes, fat chance, right?
And so, Peter, just the last word. Do you agree with this?
Yes. Again, historically, Jimmy Carter made the same mistake. He took his recession late rather than early. And that's what Biden has done by stalling around. Basically, they have been putting off the Grim Reaper, and it's about to arrive. My feeling is we are going to have a slowdown next year. I don't know that we can call anything a soft landing if we don't get down to 2% inflation. I don't see much prospect for that. Biden has got his hands full. He can thank his lucky stars the Republican Party is so loyal to Donald Trump. Because if he was running against, for example, Nikki Haley, Mr. Biden would be toast.
Okay, well, we're gonna remember that assessment. I want to thank you, Naomi Lim, Peter Morisi, Paulo Van Schirach, for joining us this week on Dactyl Washington. I live just over the border between the state of Maryland and the District of Columbia. That is Washington, D.C. I drive to work in Washington just about every day of the week. I lived in DC for more than a decade and have worked here for more than 30 years. In that time, I have witnessed a remarkable transformation, with the city blossoming from a place where few people would risk venturing out after dark into a world-class city brimming with arts, culture, entertainment, and vitality. But that new Washington, vibrant, engaged, exciting, full of life, is facing dark days. Gun violence, which plagued the city when I first moved here a generation ago, it's back with a vengeance. Homicides in Washington are up 37%, shootings up more than 20%, robberies up 66%, and motor vehicle thefts are up a stunning 106%. More juveniles were killed in Washington in the first 7 months of this year than in all of last year. Washington recently passed 200 murders in 2023, a number it didn't reach last year until the final few days of December. And how are the police doing in catching these killers? According to the Washington Post, police have closed only 44% of homicide cases, the lowest rate in at least 16 years. It's important to note that gun violence increased all over the country during the pandemic, a combination of tough economic times, school closures, and lots of people spending a lot more time cooped up with each other than ever before. America's urban centers were hardest hit, and Washington was no exception. With the waning of the pandemic, statistics improved just about everywhere. But here, Washington has been an outlier. The numbers are getting worse, and behind every number is a real person, often a child or a teenager. The police chief in Washington places a lot of blame for a rise in violence on a flood of illegal guns available in the city. There are other factors. The police force lost a lot of officers in recent years with a backlog of recruitment, and Washington faces a hurdle unique in the country, the fact that, as the federal city, defined as such by the Constitution, laws passed by its overwhelmingly Democratic city council have to be approved by a Republican-controlled Congress, which only recently rejected a crime bill because it was viewed as too soft on criminals. What are the answers? Recruiting, training, and deploying more police is essential. Enforcing a juvenile curfew in selected areas is key. More aggressive efforts to get illegal guns off the street is important. One area that needs special effort, according to Colbert King, a local columnist I follow closely, is the need to impose tougher sentences on serial offenders, who he says are responsible for a disproportionate number of crimes and killings. I believe in doing all of the above and fast. This is our federal district, our national capital, a city we should show off with pride to the world. And most importantly, a city we should be able to protect and defend for the sake of its more than 700,000 inhabitants, especially its kids. We need to do better. وبهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذا البرنامج، وخاصة حول الدور المناسب للحكومة في اقتصادنا الوطني، يرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على الهاشتاج داخل واشنطن، أو مراسلوني مباشرة على @Rob Satloff. أراكم الأسبوع القادم. إلى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.